want to introduce the person that's about to take over. I hope he does more than I've been doing. Fred Iutzi, one of our fellows. Grew up on a farm in western Illinois, right where Missouri, Illinois, and what's that other state, Iowa, come together. 1,000 acres, seventh generation farmer, just moved from the farm where one of his ancestors been working at Western Illinois University, master's degree in agronomy at Iowa State University, one of our graduate fellows that, most of them, they would just come back as long as we were paying them. He came back for 7 years, 7 consecutive years, or maybe not consecutive, 7 years during the fellows program. But Fred, 37 years old, and he's ready to rock and roll. There you go.
Sit down. So I would like everybody who was sitting in the bleachers in the rain yesterday to raise your hand. Let's give these people a hand for their fortitude. That was my moment here that I knew that I was really in the right place. That's fortitude at a talk. Raise your hand if you're freezing cold. I have good news for you. Wes has thoughtfully arranged to move my talk to a warmer time of the day. So he's gone to, but you won't suffer quite as much. So my assignment was to talk to you about the future. So on the morning of May 13th, 1922, a line of automobiles arrived at the Millard G. and Sadie Lambert farm north of Adrian, Illinois, carrying Professor W.F. Hanshin and 75 eager University of Illinois undergrads who were capping off a semester of studies in Farm Management 1 with a field inspection trip to see emerging scientific principles of agriculture in action on working farms in western Illinois. The party was slated to spend an hour on this site near Adrian, the Lambert farm, before departing for the next farm on the itinerary. I have a little experience departing from that same site. I just did so about 6 weeks ago. My children were the 6th and I the 5th to live on that family farmstead. I have to say, Wes has dropped the F-bomb in introducing me. Said I was a 7th generation farmer and a 7th in my family in the county. I can't take on that honorific, at least not yet. I was a participant in my last status in the family farming operation. I didn't have anything at risk in the operation, and so I was not a farmer. I was a member and a supporter of a farm family, but I didn't have anything at risk financially. This party of University of Illinois students and their farm management professor was at this farmstead. 5 hours pass, 4 more farms pass. And in the same line of cars, there'd be a lot of Model Ts, there'd be Rios and things along that line. Got to the last stop of the day, the Dana and Laura Stevenson farm west of Elveston, Illinois. I have a little bit of experience arriving at that stop, which is something I first did when I was about 4 days old. That is a farmstead that my great-grandfather Stevenson moved 1 mile to start farming there with his new bride in 1915. And in 2016, that quarter section is the centerpiece of my parents' 1,000-acre farming operation today. So the students arrive 4 p.m. If they were on schedule, May 13th, 1922. We don't have a historical record on whether they were dusty or whether they were muddy, but it would have been one of the two. We know pretty conclusively. They would have had an eyeful by that time in the day. M.G. Lambert would have described his careful soil fertility management system, his skillful management and allocation of horse labor, as the term that was in use then would say, his deep involvement in organizing multiple farmer cooperatives in that part of the state in the early stages in 1922 and to get to greater success in the years that followed. Both my great-grandfathers on the itinerary that day would have described their implementation of the McLean County system of swine sanitation as a parasite control management technique that's one of the first truly ecologically based farming practices that emerged from the scientific agriculture era. They would have talked about the Farm Financial Accounting Records Project that both farms had been part of for 10 years already in 1922. On the Stevenson farm in particular, my great-grandfather, Dana Stevenson, would have walked the students through his intricate system of crop sequences and of field borders designed to maximize field efficiency, to allow for long rotations. I think that's the term for it, at least, rotations, that include sod crops and thereby minimize soil erosion and maximize soil fertility sponsored within the system. They only had half an hour on the agenda to see this, if they stuck with the agenda, and so presumably the students relied less on walking the farm and more on the series of 10 meticulously hand-drafted farm maps, field maps that they were given in their packet that showed my great-grandparents' plan for gradually reorganizing and restoring their quarter section over a 10-year period. Now, the student packet had lists of questions that the students were to answer based on their inspection tour. They included, are the fields readily accessible? Does the organization of this farm layout require long lanes to reach the fields? What use is made of rough land? How many acres of permanent pasture will there be? Are minor rotations used for hogs? Does the proportion of crops grown ensure the maintenance of nitrogen? How much corn for feeding is purchased each year? Is the nitrogen thus brought onto the farm conserved for the soil? How does the proportion of various crops grown affect the distribution of horse labor? Is the farm suited to tractor operation? State reasons why or why not. Now, I'll pause, and if Ricardo Salvador is still manning the wall there, does that sound similar to any course that you may have taught before, Ricardo? Yeah, this is Sustainable Ag 509. I got an A- in that course. How do you get an A- in a travel course? I think there might have been one assignment, and I only half-handed it in. Might have been how it worked. So the close attention to field layouts and crop rotations, the careful integration of crop and livestock production, the accounting for nutrients, the general intentionality about soil stewardship, and the close budgeting of both human and horse labor were not something unique to my great-grandparents, but they were characteristic of the sort of the confluence of traditions of stewardship that dated back quite a long time and the emerging disciplines of scientific farming at the beginning of the century, agronomy, animal husbandry, farm management in particular. There was huge labor, intellectual and physical, that was expended in that era, late 19th, early 20th century, establishing a public agricultural research and extension capacity, most notably the land grant system, USDA. The fruit of those labors was expected to be an agriculture that was not only productive, that was not only efficient, but an agriculture that was permanent. My great-grandfather Stevenson was a sophomore at the University of Illinois when Professor Cyril G. Hopkins published Soil Fertility and Permanent Agriculture in 1910, which anchored what would become known as the Illinois system of permanent agriculture. Cyril Hopkins was known, first of all, for foundational contributions actually to plant breeding, before foundational contributions to soil scientists, to soil science. He was one of the first agronomy faculty members ever hired anywhere. Secondly, known for being testy and irate. So I'm imagining he was fun to have in class. I don't know if my great-grandfather took his one of his courses or not. So he opens this 1910 volume, his sort of opus. It is the purpose of this book to teach the science of soil fertility and permanent agriculture, chiefly by reporting facts rather than by offering theories, and anyone of common sense who reads the English language and can understand the common school arithmetic can understand this book if he will study it. As a parenthetical, the fact may well be recognized that some who have ample time for study, though physically industrious, are mentally lazy. Then there's a footnote attached to the word lazy, connected to the word lazy, where he goes on at greater length. So it was the first Methodist soil science textbook, we can say. So over 700 pages, Hopkins is expounding, and again in 1910 many of the very same tools that we currently think of in our sustainable agriculture toolbox today. The superiority of green manure crops, cover crops to commercial fertilizers as a source of nitrogen, the need to carefully steward and manage the nutrient and carbon cycles among crop and livestock enterprises. And Hopkins even questions in this book, 1910, the fundamental wisdom of feeding grain crops to livestock when the same grain could feed so many more people if it were directly in people's diets. Hopkins and F.H. King, which is a name that more of you may know than Hopkins, were correspondents across state lines. And Hopkins most likely considered himself to be providing a message drawn from Midwestern U.S. agriculture, aimed in a more practitioner way at Midwest U.S. agriculture, comparable in philosophy, I think Hopkins thought, to what King was doing in Farmers of 40 Centuries. So, so Hopkins' permanent agriculture was a soil fertility scenario, but others around him were rounding the concept out. Dean Eugene Davenport, who was responsible for handling Hopkins, which took considerable effort, no doubt, in 1920 published an article that declared victory on permanent agriculture and looked ahead to some concepts that are yet even closer to the discourses that we have today around sustainable farming and food systems. He wrote, the idea of a permanent agriculture is definitely fixed in the minds of nearly all the progressive farmers of Illinois, whereby the fertility of the lands shall be maintained and not mined out as the generations pass. To that determination, we are now beginning to add the idea of a finished agriculture, by which is meant not necessarily intensive farming, but rather systems of farming which shall be more diversified than heretofore, and which shall recognize more completely the peculiar demands of the consuming public and the particular resources of the various localities. 1929, nationally, so eve of the Great Depression, not there yet, Rexford Tugwell, New Dealer, but then still Columbia University economics, wrote about, quote, moving toward the cereal reduction and grass increase stage of U.S. agriculture. First of all, Tugwell wrote, there would be less cultivation. Crops which called for excessive bearing of the soil would be greatly reduced. I'll budget myself one aside. Here we're allowed asides here. He thought that the policy vehicle that was going to best accommodate these changes in a more ecological vein were the McNary-Haugen Acts, which were a series of agricultural reform bills in the 20s that we're moving through. And so this aside gives me an opportunity to quote my great-grandfather Lambert here, the July 26th number of the Hancock County Farm Bureau Bulletin. The seed of equality for agriculture has been thoroughly sown, and it is abundantly growing in these acts, which were not passed ultimately. So, not even 1930 here, and we've got everything figured out. Did you guys know that everything was figured out before 1930? So let's go back to May 1922, the dusty or muddy, whichever it was that day on the farm tour. The bulk of the fundamental principles we associate with sustainable agriculture were in place. Nutrient cycling, ecologically based pest management, diverse crop rotations that include short-lived perennial stands with annual crops. It was there. There was a national conversation about this, a policy conversation about bringing about a permanent agriculture. But instead of being permanent, in 1922, that essentially marked what we could call a point of peak farmer for the U.S. By 1930, the number of farms in the U.S. had already started to slump from a 1920 peak of nearly 6.5 million. Today, somewhere in the ballpark of 2.5 million is what I was obliged to write down. I mean, we know, that statistic is open to interpretation, exactly whether it's that or how much less. Average acreage per farm is more than tripled today relative to 1922. For example, my parents' farm is larger than both the Stevenson farm and the Lambert farms put together. That's in part because it includes the Stevenson and the Lambert farms put together. In 1922, returning to 1922, great-grandfather Stevenson's meticulous bar charts, again hand-drafted, plotting horse labor needs each month of the year, also part of the packet, and great-grandfather Lambert's big teams of draft horses that the state extension people would come out and write about were already under pressure by the movement to mechanization of farms. I had a chance to look at the paper ledger of the first John Deere dealership in Hancock County, Illinois, a few years ago, and on the same week in 1937, both Dana Stevenson and M.G. Lambert purchased John Deere Model A's in time for 1937 spring tillage season. And in the taken in trade column are draft horses and draft horse implements there. So fewer equine mouths to feed knocked years out of the carefully plotted 5-year crop rotations. The move to bigger implements steadily knocked field borders out of the Stevenson farm's intricate crop map. And despite Cyril Hopkins' lectures about using legumes to get no-cost nitrogen out of the air, American farmers had doubled their 1920 commercial fertilizer use by 1950 and doubled it again by the mid-1960s. These increases in fertilizer application, combined with concentration of livestock production and the concentration of manure that resulted, as well as indiscriminate tile drainage management, introduced surface water quality as a problem to agriculture. So to turn to the big problems, we're still losing soil from agriculture. The good news is that the outrageously high soil loss levels that gave Wes his come-to-Jesus moment in 1977 with the GAO report have been dialed back to relatively close to the T value, the so-called tolerable level of soil loss. That's the good news. The bad news is that T values are close to meaningless. Rick Cruz from Iowa State put it recently, since T values do not represent soil renewal rates, and they don't even try how they're put together, using T as a soil management criterion is synonymous with a depletion schedule, a soil depletion schedule. In 2016, on flat black dirt in Iowa, it's a slower depletion schedule on flat black than it is on steep soil, but it's a depletion schedule. We're also on a depletion schedule for the ability of the atmosphere to support stable weather year to year, and agriculture is in the very sorry position of being a net contributor to that problem rather than the net solution that it ought to be. And then, last and not certainly least, the too often the products of our agriculture are going to enrich the already rich and neo-colonize the already colonized. So I've been asked over the last couple weeks several times already how my leadership will differ from that of the outgoing president. I understand that Wes has been referred to at times as Dr. Doom. I don't anticipate being referred to that way because the proper way to address me will be Mr. Doom. We are making a transition here. But so I will say, so there are things that have been achieved in agriculture over the last 30 or 50 or 100 years of which we can be genuinely proud. No-till, reduced tillage systems in their context have reduced soil erosion substantially in cropping systems that in cases where under plow tillage there was not an appropriate rotation to cover the soil, cover and regenerate the soil. Relative to the worst days of the 50s and 60s, we've backed down on the toxicity of pesticide materials we've used. Many of the agricultural cooperatives that were founded at the opening of the 20th century continue to help independent farmers make their way in the marketplace. They simultaneously make things worse, but they do genuinely have a role in making things better. And I'll say in my previous work that I just left to come here, I've seen mainline ag co-ops on the principle of cooperation among cooperatives helping local food co-ops get started. It's a positive thing. So as the father of a daughter who you met the other day, I'm very pleased that we've made some progress, at least, on easing rigid gender roles in agriculture and in rural culture. A lot of work left on that, but we've made some progress. And I'll say that for all the pervasiveness of the industrial ag matrix that farming is embedded in, at least on the farms that remain, we do have a significant number of intact family and cultural lineages that are out there. I grew up on a farm of 1,000 acres, but at the same time I was taught constantly that I had the responsibility to know something about every one of those 1,000 acres. I didn't immediately learn what the term soil conservation was, but I knew where my great-grandfather Stevenson's remaining soil conservation structures of 1920s and 30s vintage were on the farm. And from my father, who is probably the least angry man that I have ever known in my life, I was taught to feel angry when I see unchecked soil erosion. So I think that we can give ourselves permission, and many of you have these stories, we can give ourselves permission to feel proud of the things that we've done right. But the point here is that the Land Institute has never argued that agriculture is incapable of doing anything right whatsoever. Rather, the Land Institute's argument is based on the idea that conventional agriculture and most of the alternatives proposed to it to date don't provide a system for getting things right, a system that's indexed to ecosystem in which soil and farm and community can simultaneously prosper. Now, the Land Institute's argument is based on the idea that most of our successes in agriculture have been the whack-a-mole kind of success, where you trade reduced soil erosion under no-till for increased herbicide load. You trade reduced herbicide use for increased inter-row tillage. You improve drainage, but you increase nutrient loss. You reduce nitrogen loss, but you do it by adding an additional biocide to the system in the form of nitrification inhibitor. You reduce nitrogen loss, but you do it by running on wet fields in the spring with a fertilizer rig and causing compaction. You reintroduce cover crops, but you do it in a big equipment-centric way that threatens to become an additional pathway for large producers to outcompete small. You fix a lot of carbon by producing a lot of crop biomass, crop residue, and you drop it on the surface of the soil and let it burn up there, or you mix it into the soil and you let it burn up there. You create an optimal environment for an annual crop to flourish in, and you create an optimum environment for an annual weed to flourish in. You create a detailed crop production budget only to find that almost everything on it represents an expenditure of time and treasure on fighting the ecosystem processes that are already at work in the field. You raise record-breaking yields, but you still see rural communities slipping away. What we argue at the Land Institute is not that there are no successes whatsoever in conventional agriculture. We argue that there is life for us beyond whack-a-mole. It's time to stop fighting ecosystem processes and instead start learning from ecosystems and mimicking the processes in them. So that's my introduction here, and to tackle my assignment here, Psalm 90, verse 17, establish the work of our hands. 14,600 days ago, give or take a few, I suppose, Wes Jackson planted a seed here on this property. That seed germinated into an organism in the plant kingdom that struggled and ultimately thrived through the tough establishment phase that it's tough to be a seedling in, and put deep roots into the ground. The organism that's proved winter hardy, this is a crucial point, and able to regenerate itself year after year without the need for constant tillage and reseeding. An organism with enough phenotypic plasticity to respond to its environment, but to still retain its original genotype. An organism that is of the seed and that is the seed, but that is now known for its plantness rather than its seedness. For now the earth yields crops by itself, first the blade, then the head, and then the full grain in the head. So I would say that Wes has been one hell of a farmer here on this place in growing this organization. Yeah. I don't know if he's cowering in the corner, but there he is. Establish the work of our hands. The Land Institute has never been stronger, and the natural systems agriculture vision, the perennial polyculture vision, has never been in sharper focus. Yesterday, you heard from the research team in a time slot that it's not accidental is the longest time slot on the schedule. You heard Wes give the vision forward for the research team. We've heard progress on the C3 grass in the mixture, both of them. Kernza responding strongly to selection, undergoing genome sequencing, and that's hinting at the future of this perennial grain system in its presence in fields and ovens and in stills, in small amounts yet, but amounts that hint of the future here. The perennial wheat that's bringing in a level of yield that's more like a crop than like a wild species, which is a good thing in one of these efforts, and is showing promise in several different breeding approaches to bring the perennial character into it. The C4 grass component, perennial sorghum, there's real traction with the wide hybridization that Stan is doing, and Fiona, to get perennialism into that crop. Selection is underway on 3 different continents for perennial sorghum right now. The composite crop here, Silphium, is showing ever-increasing promise as a perennial oilseed component, adapted both to regions with dependable rainfall. You can be the judge of whether that describes your own region or not, or to the more drought-prone parts of the world. And collaborations are underway in South America and elsewhere to move silphium forward. And we're very excited. I'm excited partially because he's already hired, and I didn't have to mess with it. They reeled in a really good guy to be the legume breeder right off the bat. Here has been hired to choose one or more candidate species for the legume component of the polyculture here, and we're getting Brandon underway on that at the same time that, as Wes described, that this really unprecedented global inventory to cast an even wider net for species to domesticate and or perennialize is underway with the good folks in St. Louis and under funding from Malone. And so last but certainly not least, the integrating principle here over all the wild and crazy breeding on the agroecology front here, the science is being laid down here that, among other things, is going to enable understanding of the soil microbiome that's going to allow these systems to sponsor their own soil fertility and to sponsor their own resistance to pests and diseases. It's underway not only here in-house, but it's underway at KU, again under the Malone funding. So 16 years ago, several hours into my first visit to the Land Institute, Wes asked me what burning questions that I had so far been too polite to ask. And so I responded with, where are the perennial grain crops? And he sort of hemmed and hawed and got to very good reasons about where in the process it was. But I can say today the answer is a little bit different. It's been through Wes's vision and determination before 16 years ago, 16 years hence as well. It's through the really exceptional team of scientists that's gelled and stuck here. It's through the operations staff that enable the scientists to work. It's through a steady-minded board. It's through a community of supporters that you yourselves are representing. I would say that question has been very crisply answered now that a sort of a snotty-nosed undergrad came up with 16 years ago. The perennial grain crops are on the horizon. We've got a long road still to drive. We can see them on the horizon in 2016. So tremendous research momentum and a bold vision. That there's been a lot of momentum and vision casting that's happened over the last 100 years. And so I'm a little nervous by the fact that there's been a lot of vision casting over the last 100 years. Some of the failures in this past vision casting are easier to analyze than others of them. Cyril Hopkins and his permanent agriculture vision, so impressive and ahead of its time in some respects, had a narrow scientific underpinning. As it was summarized again by poor Dean Davenport, and this is, you'll recognize Dean speak here. The basis of the Illinois system of permanent agriculture is the addition to the land of somewhat larger amounts of fertility than are removed by cropping and by natural causes, and the recognition of the economic necessity of employing for this purpose the cheapest available materials, attention being confined for the most part to the limiting element in the particular soil in question. So, I mean, there's a fundamental soil science discovery, that I'm slightly mocking there, in an unfair way. Plants need plant essential elements to grow, and we need to be on top of that fact. We're fortunate that the soil scientists of that era discovered that. That's a necessary discovery for what we're doing, but of course now we know it's not a sufficient discovery, that there's a ledger book of nutrients in the soil to withdraw and deposit from. So even though there was a lot more waiting to be discovered, the university scientists of the time had found a killer app, and so they pressed forward with it. That was the system of permanent agriculture in Illinois, was getting on top of the ledger book in the soil. So among other things, I'll say I hope this speaks to you a little bit about why the Land Institute research culture is to think things through and let research results get to full fruition before we start releasing things to everyone who's begging for things to be released to. Another reason for the impermanence of permanent agriculture was a failure to consider context. Hopkins, again, was strident about cropping systems sponsoring their own nitrogen fertility through the intensive use of legume crops as grain manures and for meticulous accounting for livestock manure nutrients. But the only reason that he managed to articulate for this is that commercial fertilizer was expensive. Hopkins' main farmer-oriented publication was called The Farm That Won't Wear Out, published in 1913, which also happens to be the same year that the first pilot commercial-scale production runs of Haber-Bosch ammonia took place in Germany. Commercial fertilizer was, sort of to understate it, was not destined to stay expensive. So I hope this speaks to you about why we're prone to talk here about not only the agronomic characteristics of the crops that we're working on, but the economic embeddedness that they'll have under various scenarios. So finally, in 1919, Cyril Hopkins was returning to the U.S. From a long study trip on the degraded soils of Greece when, as he was eulogized in the journal Science, he was struck down at the zenith of his powers, as they said. But the results of his trip were still compiled from notes published in 1922, How Greece Can Produce More Food, very subtle title. Hopkins writes in a section titled, God's Commandment Disobeyed. He writes, the greatest agricultural problem of Greece is to enrich the soil. This is a duty which has long been neglected and even against the commandment of God. For in the first chapter of the Holy Scriptures we read, and God said unto them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and subdue it. The first part of this commandment has been obeyed, for the people have multiplied. But the second part has been disobeyed, for they have taken from the soil and have not replenished it. Instead of subduing the earth and having dominion over it and making it produce larger crops, the people of Greece have abandoned vast areas of land once cultivated, end quote. So after wearing a soil down to a nubbin after centuries of intensive farming, the diagnosis was insufficient domination of the earth. So I hope that this speaks to you about, I've really got nothing on that one, so I'm going to move on. So I don't go through this to torment the ghosts of soil scientists past here, but to suggest that researching new agricultural techniques, bringing them into use, has always been a fraught process, and one that society has had a mixed track record on, to sort of state it mildly. What we need to do is to reduce the frequency of dumb mistakes in an era where dumb mistakes are increasingly likely to be fatal. We need to cultivate a greater aptitude in future scientists, future farmers, and in all the rest of us for situating that which we have contrived, including more or less every aspect of what we label our agriculture and our economy, into the context of that which is real, which is the ecosphere that we're an integral part of. So that brings me to the other project we've discussed here at this Prairie Festival, the work that Wes and Bill and Aubrey and many others here are embarking on in the Ecospheric Studies Initiative. It's noteworthy that the great success of the flagship research program in perennial polyculture development that's going on here grew out of, as you've just heard, something that was founded as an educational institution. So it's interesting to see where this chapter goes. The process organizational theorist, Robert Chia, did you know there were process organizational theorists? There's process, a lot of things, writes that each organizational outcome always already incorporates the weight of its genealogical past, which in turn creates potentialities for the future. The past is immanent in the present. This objectivity of the past in the subjective present means that contemporary fact is always loaded with possibilities and can be continually enriched with newer and novel understandings and application. He then quotes Alfred North Whitehead directly, who wrote simply, it's the only simple Whitehead quote I've ever seen, "The future is there in the present. The past is here in the present, and the future is there in the present." So we can see now compounding effects of the various chapters that have gone on at the Land Institute. So Psalm 90, verse 17, I'll give you the unabridged verse this time. "Let the beauty of the Lord our God be upon us, and establish the work of our hands." I happen to fall into the demographic of liberal Christianity, and so most weeks the main place I get my exercise is by squirming uncomfortably when God language comes up. So I think, though, that I'm going to let myself off the hook on this here, because the truth that we need here today in Psalm 90 is not a transcendent truth. The truth that we need here is an immanent truth. It's an indwelling truth, indwelling within us and in everything around us. And so the critical wording here is not the Lord our God. The critical wording is beauty. Over 40 years here, over 100 years, over 10,000 years, we've seen the folly of working without a big idea. But we've also seen, what we have also seen are the pitfalls of trusting our big human ideas too much. So we're embarked on work here that we hope and that we expect will give us crops that make our agroecosystems more whole. It'll give us the ecological groundedness to make our minds more whole. And through all of you, our supporters and our allies, many other initiatives that'll make our society more whole. But beyond what our big brains expect right now in this moment, we know that ultimately our North Star here and your North Star must be beauty and symmetry that we find in the ecosphere. So there's been, so today certainly is not about me. We know that for sure. Today is about Wes, but it's partially about Wes. What today really is about the Land Institute. Today is graduation day for the Land Institute. What started as the vision of one man moving out on the land has grown into a movement that's sitting right here. Some of it's moved to the door, but they're with us. It started as a movement. What started as a seed has grown into a plant. And what started with recognition of our radical disconnectedness has grown into a sense of deep and abiding ecological interconnectedness. So we've got work to do here. Let beauty be upon us and establish the work of our hands. Thank you very much.